History loves dynasties, but what about the blood price they demand? What happens when keeping your crown means destroying your own child? Today, we're diving into the darkest chapter of African royalty, a story that will shatter everything you believe about parental love and the corrupting power of absolute rule. This is the story of Emperor Dawit I of Ethiopia, a brilliant ruler who expanded his empire across East Africa and claimed descent from King Solomon himself. He was a devout Christian who built magnificent churches and protected his people from foreign invasion. But here's the shocking truth that Ethiopian historians tried to hide for centuries. When his own son threatened his power, this loving father made the most horrifying choice in royal history. He ordered his beloved child to be executed. How does a man who spent his life protecting his family become the architect of his own son's death? This isn't just another medieval power struggle. This is about what happens when the weight of an entire empire rests on one person's shoulders. How far would you go to prevent civil war? What would you sacrifice to save thousands of lives? By the end of this story, you'll understand how a father's love became a king's nightmare, and how one impossible decision created a dynasty that would rule Ethiopia for over 700 years, but destroyed the soul of the man who made it possible. Step into 14th century Ethiopia, a Christian empire surrounded by Muslim kingdoms and European powers hungry for African gold. This isn't the Ethiopia of modern headlines. This is one of the most powerful and sophisticated civilizations in medieval Africa. The Ethiopian Empire claims a bloodline stretching back to the legendary Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. Their emperors rule from mountain fortresses that touch the clouds. Their churches are carved directly into solid rock. Their armies control trade routes that connect Africa to Asia and Europe. But empires built on legend are fragile things. Every generation brings new challenges to the royal bloodline. Rebellious nobles question the emperor's legitimacy. Neighboring kingdoms probe for weakness. Internal rivals claim better rights to the throne. In this world, showing mercy to family members who threaten your rule isn't just dangerous, it's suicidal. It invites civil war, foreign invasion, and the collapse of everything your ancestors built. In 1380, Emperor Dawit I faces the crisis that will define his reign and haunt his legacy forever. His eldest son, Prince Tewodros, has grown from a beloved child into a charismatic young man who commands the loyalty of powerful nobles and military commanders. The prince isn't planning rebellion, not yet, but whispers fill the royal court. Some say Tewodros would make a better emperor than his father. Others suggest the aging Dawit should step aside for the younger, stronger prince. These aren't just palace rumors. In Ethiopian tradition, emperors who lose the confidence of their nobles can be deposed or killed. Royal succession isn't automatic. It's earned through political support and military strength. Dawit, I must make an impossible choice. Trust his son and risk losing his throne, or eliminate the threat and lose his soul. What happens next will transform a loving father into one of history's most tragic figures and establish a precedent of royal ruthlessness that will echo through Ethiopian history for centuries. Dawit, I wasn't born to rule. He was the younger son of Emperor Niwaya Krestos, expected to live a comfortable but secondary life as a royal prince, while his older brother prepared for the throne. Young Dawit studied military strategy, learned multiple languages, and developed the diplomatic skills that would later make him one of Ethiopia's greatest emperors. But royal bloodlines are unpredictable. When plague swept through the Ethiopian highlands in 1360, it claimed not just thousands of common people, but also the crown prince and several other royal heirs. Suddenly, the scholarly younger prince found himself next in line for the most powerful throne in East Africa. Dawit's rise to power in 1382 was neither smooth nor certain. Ethiopian nobles expected their new emperor to prove himself through military conquest and political cunning. Being born royal wasn't enough. You had to earn the crown through strength and wisdom. Emperor Dawit I proved himself spectacularly. Within his first 5 years of rule, he had expanded Ethiopian territory southward into present-day Somalia and Kenya. His armies defeated Muslim kingdoms that had threatened Ethiopian borders for decades. His diplomatic missions established trade relationships with European powers and Asian merchants. More importantly, Dawit understood that lasting power came not just from military victory, but from cultural and religious authority. He commissioned the construction of magnificent rock-hewn churches that demonstrated Ethiopian engineering prowess. He patronized scholars and artists who created illuminated manuscripts that rivaled anything produced in medieval Europe. Under Dawit's rule, the Ethiopian capital of Gondar became a cosmopolitan center where African, Arab, and European influences blended into something uniquely Ethiopian. Foreign visitors marveled at the sophistication of his court and the wealth of his empire. Despite his political and military responsibilities, Dawit I was known as a loving family man. When his son Tewodros was born in 1365, the emperor personally oversaw the prince's education and training. Dawit wanted his son to be everything a future emperor needed: a skilled warrior, a wise administrator, a devout Christian, and a charismatic leader. He arranged for the finest tutors to teach Tewodros languages, mathematics, theology, and military strategy. Father and son would spend hours together reviewing maps, discussing political strategy, and planning military campaigns. Dawit included Tewodros in state ceremonies and diplomatic meetings, preparing him for eventual succession to the throne. European visitors to the Ethiopian court wrote admiringly about the relationship between emperor and prince. One Portuguese diplomat noted, "The affection between His Imperial Majesty and the young prince is evident to all who observe them. The emperor clearly takes great pride in his son's accomplishments. As Tewodros grew into young manhood, he exceeded even his father's ambitious expectations. By age 18, he was commanding military expeditions and winning decisive victories against Ethiopian enemies. His tactical innovations impressed veteran generals. His personal courage inspired ordinary soldiers. More dangerously, Tewodros possessed something his father lacked: natural charisma that made people want to follow him. When the prince entered a room, conversations stopped. When he spoke at court gatherings, nobles listened with an attention they rarely gave the emperor himself." Dawit: "I watched his son's growing popularity with mixed emotions. As a father, he was proud of Tewodros's accomplishments. As an emperor, he was beginning to worry about the political implications of having such a charismatic heir. By 1380, quiet conversations were taking place in noble houses throughout the Ethiopian Empire. The aging Emperor Dawit, now in his 50s, was still capable and respected. But Prince Tewodros represented something exciting: youth, military brilliance, and the promise of even greater conquests. Some nobles began suggesting that perhaps the empire would benefit from younger leadership. Others wondered whether Dawit I might consider stepping aside in favor of his obviously superior son. These weren't treasonous conversations. Not yet. In Ethiopian political culture, it was acceptable for nobles to discuss royal succession as long as they remained respectful and theoretical. But Dawit understood the dangerous momentum that such discussions could create. Ethiopian history was filled with emperors who had been encouraged to abdicate in favor of more popular family members. Sometimes these transitions happened peacefully. More often, they involved imprisonment, exile, or death for the displaced ruler. Dawit: "I found himself facing an impossible situation. His son wasn't plotting against him. Tewodros remained dutiful and respectful in all their interactions. But the prince's very excellence was creating political pressure that threatened the emperor's position." In private moments, Dawit agonized over his options. He could confront Tewodros directly, but what would he say? "Son, you're too successful, too popular, too good at everything I've trained you to do?" He could remove Tewodros from positions of military and political responsibility, but that would require public explanations that might actually accelerate the whispered succession discussions. He could arrange for Tewodros to be sent on a long diplomatic mission or military campaign far from the capital, but that would only postpone the fundamental problem while potentially giving the prince opportunities to build even stronger loyalty among distant nobles and commanders. In late 1380, events moved beyond Dawit's control. A group of influential nobles approached the emperor with a carefully worded petition suggesting that the empire would benefit from fresh leadership and the energy of youth. They weren't directly calling for Dawit's abdication, but the message was clear. Support for Tewodros' eventual succession was becoming support for his immediate elevation to the throne. Dawit, I realized that he was facing the same crisis that had destroyed other Ethiopian emperors. His beloved son, through no fault of his own, had become an existential threat to his father's rule. The emperor, who had spent decades building and protecting his empire, now faced a terrible choice: destroy his own child or risk losing everything he had worked to create. What happened next would haunt Ethiopian royal history for centuries and transform a loving father into one of monarchy's most tragic figures. Winter of 1380 brought Emperor Dawit I face-to-face with a crisis that had no good solutions. Palace informants reported that noble conversations about Prince Tewodros were becoming bolder and more explicit. Military commanders were openly praising the prince's leadership while subtly criticizing the emperor's recent decisions. Most dangerously, foreign ambassadors were beginning to treat Tewodros as the real power behind the Ethiopian throne. When diplomatic delegations arrived at court, they sought private audiences with the prince as often as with the emperor himself. Dawit, I understood that this wasn't just about personal pride or family dynamics. Ethiopian imperial power depended entirely on the perception of strength and legitimacy. Any sign of weakness or division within the royal family would invite challenges from rival claimants to the throne, rebellious provincial governors, and foreign enemies. The emperor had seen this pattern destroy other dynasties. It always started the same way: a popular heir, growing noble support, whispered suggestions about succession, and then sudden crisis when someone decided to accelerate the timeline. In January 1381, Dawit I convened a secret meeting with his most trusted advisors. These weren't court nobles who might have divided loyalties, but longtime companions who had served the emperor for decades and owed their positions entirely to his favor. The discussion that took place in that closed chamber would remain one of the most closely guarded secrets in Ethiopian history. According to fragments of records that survived centuries of palace intrigue, the emperor presented his advisors with a stark assessment of the political situation. Prince Tewodros, through his own excellence and charisma, had become an involuntary threat to imperial stability. Noble support for the prince wasn't necessarily disloyal to the emperor, but it created the conditions for a succession crisis that could tear the empire apart. The advisors agreed that traditional solutions wouldn't work. Exile would make Tewodros a rallying point for opposition. Imprisonment would create a martyr. Removing him from official duties would signal weakness and fear. One advisor, whose name was deliberately erased from all records, suggested the unthinkable. The prince would have to die. Historical accounts suggest that Dawit I initially rejected the idea with horror. This was his beloved son, the child he had raised and trained, the young man who represented everything noble about Ethiopian royalty. But over the following weeks, the emperor began to see the terrible logic in his advisor's suggestion. In medieval political thinking, the survival of the empire was more important than any individual life, even a royal one. Dawit I spent sleepless nights wrestling with the decision. Palace servants reported seeing the emperor walking the corridors at dawn, looking haggard and tormented. According to later accounts written by court historians, the emperor began justifying the decision through religious reasoning. If God had placed him on the throne, then protecting that throne from any threat, even his own son, was a divine responsibility. Ethiopian Christian theology included concepts about sacrificial leadership that dated back to biblical times. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, David's struggles with his rebellious son Absalom. These stories provided precedents for the horrible choice Dawit I was contemplating. By March 1381, the emperor had made his decision. Prince Tewodros would have to die, but it had to appear accidental or natural. An obviously suspicious death would create exactly the kind of succession crisis that the execution was meant to prevent. The plan that emerged from the emperor's secret councils was sophisticated and ruthless. Prince Tewodros would be sent to lead a military expedition against Muslim raiders in the empire's southern provinces. During the campaign, he would die in what appeared to be a legitimate battle casualty. The beauty of this approach was that it would make Tewodros a hero rather than a victim. His death would be mourned as a national tragedy rather than questioned as political murder. Noble supporters would have no martyred prince around whom to rally opposition to the emperor. In the weeks before Prince Tewodros' departure for what would be his final campaign, father and son spent considerable time together. Palace observers noted that the emperor seemed unusually emotional and affectionate during these interactions. Dawit I was reportedly giving his son detailed advice about military strategy, political leadership, and royal responsibility. To outside observers, it looked like a father preparing his heir for important duties. In reality, it may have been a condemned man trying to pass on final wisdom to the son he was about to destroy. Prince Tewodros, completely unaware of his father's intentions, responded with the dutiful affection and respect that had always characterized their relationship. He thanked the emperor for the opportunity to lead the southern campaign and promised to make his father proud through decisive victory over Ethiopian enemies. These conversations would later torment Dawit through his conscience. His son's trust and love made the planned betrayal even more horrific, but also seemed to confirm that Tewodros posed a threat precisely because he was so worthy of loyalty and admiration. When Prince Tewodros left the capital in April 1381 to begin his southern campaign, the farewell ceremony was elaborate and public. The emperor presented his son with special weapons and blessing, emphasizing the importance of the mission and his confidence in the prince's abilities. Ethiopian court chroniclers recorded that both father and son were emotional during the farewell. The emperor embraced Tewodros longer than usual and spoke about the pride he felt in his son's accomplishments. Prince Tewodros rode out of the capital accompanied by carefully selected military commanders and a force of several thousand warriors. What he didn't know was that his father had given secret instructions to certain officers in his expedition. The young prince was riding toward his own execution, planned and ordered by the man who loved him most in the world. The military expedition proceeded normally for several weeks. Prince Tewodros led his forces through the Ethiopian highlands toward the contested southern territories where Muslim raiders had been attacking Christian settlements. The prince's tactical skills were on full display. He successfully coordinated complex troop movements, established secure supply lines, and prepared for engagements with enemy forces. His officers reported that he was performing exactly as his father's training had prepared him to do. In late May 1381, Tewodros' expedition encountered a sizable force of Muslim raiders near what is now the Ethiopia-Somalia border. The ensuing battle was fierce and chaotic, with fighting spread across difficult terrain that made coordination and communication challenging. It was during this battle that the emperor's secret instructions were finally carried out. According to official reports sent back to the capital, Prince Tewodros died heroically while leading a cavalry charge against enemy positions. He was struck by multiple arrows and spears while attempting to break through Muslim lines and secure victory for Ethiopian forces. The prince's body was reportedly recovered by his loyal officers and brought back to the capital for proper royal burial. The entire empire mourned the loss of such a promising young leader who had given his life in service to his people and his Christian faith. But the true story was darker. Evidence suggests that Prince Tewodros was killed not by enemy weapons, but by members of his own expedition who had received secret orders from Emperor Dawit I. The prince died not knowing that his own father had ordered his execution, believing until his final moments that he was serving the empire and making his family proud. News of Prince Tewodros' death reached Emperor Dawit I in early June 1381. Publicly, the emperor displayed appropriate grief for a father who had lost his beloved son in military service. He ordered elaborate funeral ceremonies and declared official periods of mourning. Privately, Dawit I had achieved exactly what his political calculations demanded. The succession crisis that had threatened his reign was resolved. Noble supporters of Prince Tewodros had no choice but to transfer their loyalty back to the emperor. The threat of civil war or forced abdication had been eliminated. But the psychological cost was devastating. Court observers noted that the emperor aged dramatically in the months following his son's death. He became increasingly isolated, spending long periods in private prayer and meditation. The man who had sacrificed his own child to preserve his throne discovered that some victories are too expensive to enjoy. Dawit. I had saved his empire but destroyed his soul in the process. The decision that secured his political survival would haunt him for the rest of his reign and establish a precedent of royal ruthlessness that would influence Ethiopian imperial culture for centuries to come. In the months following Prince Tewodros' death, Emperor Dawit I achieved everything his political calculations had promised. Noble discussions about succession ended abruptly. Military commanders focused their loyalty on the emperor rather than dreaming about serving under a younger, more charismatic leader. Foreign diplomats treated Dawit I with the undivided respect due to an unchallenged ruler. Yet victory felt like defeat. Palace servants reported that the emperor had developed insomnia and spent entire nights walking the corridors of his fortress. During state ceremonies, observers noted that his eyes would drift to the empty space where Prince Tewodros had once stood. The emperor, who had always been known for his decisive leadership, began second-guessing routine decisions. Advisors found him staring at maps of the southern provinces where his son had died, lost in thoughts he shared with no one. Dawit I carried the burden of knowing that his public grief was a performance hiding a far more terrible truth. While his subjects mourned the loss of a heroic prince, the emperor wrestled with the knowledge that he had orchestrated his own son's murder. The handful of advisors who knew the truth maintained absolute silence, but their knowledge created an atmosphere of shared guilt that poisoned the emperor's inner circle. Trust, which had been the foundation of Dawit I's political success, became impossible when it was built on such a horrific secret. Religious faith, which had always sustained the emperor through difficult decisions, now became a source of torment. Ethiopian Christianity emphasized the sacred nature of family bonds and the special obligations of fathers to protect their children. Every prayer, every church service, every religious ceremony reminded Dawit of how completely he had violated these fundamental principles. The immediate political crisis had been resolved, but Dawit's decision established a precedent that would haunt the Ethiopian Solomonic Dynasty for generations. Future emperors would remember that family loyalty was subordinate to political necessity, that even the most beloved relatives could become threats requiring elimination. This lesson would be learned and applied repeatedly throughout Ethiopian royal history. Sons would view their fathers with suspicion, brothers would eliminate brothers preemptively. The royal family that claimed descent from the wise and just King Solomon became notorious for internecine violence that made medieval European dynasties look peaceful by comparison. The emperor, who had killed his son to prevent civil war, had actually made future civil wars more likely by establishing that royal family members were existential threats to each other rather than natural allies. As years passed, Dawit I became increasingly isolated from genuine human relationships. How could he trust advisors when he had used their counsel to justify murdering his own child? How could he enjoy the company of his remaining family members when he knew what he was capable of doing to people he claimed to love? The emperor's later years were marked by growing paranoia and suspicion. He saw potential threats in every ambitious noble, every popular military commander, every family member who showed signs of leadership ability. Palace life became oppressive and fearful. Courtiers learned to avoid appearing too confident or capable, lest they remind the emperor of his dead son's dangerous charisma. The court that had once been known for its cultural sophistication and intellectual vitality became a place where excellence was viewed with suspicion. Emperor Dawit I died in 1413, after ruling for over 30 years. His reign was remembered as one of the most successful in Ethiopian history. Territorial expansion, cultural achievement, economic prosperity, and political stability. But those who knew the emperor personally reported that his final years were consumed by regret and psychological torment. On his deathbed, witnesses claimed that Dawit is called out his dead son's name and asked forgiveness for sins that he could not specify publicly. The emperor's confession to his priests was kept secret, but rumors persisted that Dawit I had admitted to terrible crimes against his own family. These whispers would never be confirmed or denied, but they added to the growing legend of royal ruthlessness that surrounded the Ethiopian throne. The man who had chosen his crown over his child discovered too late that some prices are too high to pay, even for imperial power. Emperor Dawit I's story forces us to confront the darkest aspects of political power and human nature. Was he a monster who murdered his own child for selfish reasons? Or was he a tragic leader who made an impossible sacrifice to prevent civil war and protect his empire? The truth, as always, is more complex than simple moral judgments allow. From a political perspective, Dawit I's decision may have been coldly rational. Ethiopian history was filled with succession crises that destroyed dynasties and caused tremendous suffering for ordinary people. The emperor's calculation that one death might prevent thousands had precedent in medieval political thinking. Yet the human cost of this decision was devastating, not just for Prince Tewodros, who died without understanding why, but for Dawit I himself, who spent the rest of his life tormented by guilt and isolation. The Ethiopian Solomonic Dynasty that Dawit I preserved through his son's murder would indeed survive for centuries, finally ending only in 1974 with the overthrow of Emperor Haile Selassie. In that sense, the emperor's sacrifice achieved its intended purpose. But the precedent of royal fratricide that Dawit I established would poison Ethiopian imperial culture for generations. Successive emperors would murder siblings, imprison relatives, and eliminate potential rivals as a matter of routine political hygiene. The dynasty that claimed divine legitimacy through descent from King Solomon became notorious for treating family bonds as political liabilities rather than sacred relationships. Dawit I's story resonates in our contemporary world wherever leaders face conflicts between personal relationships and political responsibilities. We see echoes of his dilemma in political dynasties where family members become rivals, in corporate successions where personal and professional loyalties collide, and in any situation where maintaining power requires betraying trust. The emperor's tragedy reminds us that some victories are too expensive to celebrate, and that choices made in the name of greater good can destroy the very values they claim to protect. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this story is that we'll never know whether Dawit I's fears were justified. Would Prince Tewodros have eventually challenged his father's rule? Would noble support for the prince have led to civil war? The emperor's decision eliminated these possibilities along with his son's life, leaving us to wonder whether the threat was real or merely imagined by a paranoid ruler who had grown too attached to power to risk sharing it. Dawit I's story challenges us to examine our own relationships between love and power, trust and security, loyalty and ambition. In our families, our careers, and our communities, how do we balance competing loyalties? When do Legitimate concerns about threats become destructive paranoia. The Ethiopian emperor who killed his son to save his throne discovered that some forms of success are indistinguishable from failure, and that preserving power at the cost of love leaves you with neither. If this tragic tale of royal power and family betrayal moved you, subscribe for more hidden histories that explore the complex moral choices that shaped our world. What other leaders paid terrible personal prices for political decisions? How do we judge historical figures who made impossible choices in impossible circumstances? Share your thoughts. Was Dawit I a necessary ruler making tough decisions, or a power-mad tyrant who destroyed his own family? And what does his story teach us about the relationship between power and morality? History's darkest chapters often reveal the most about human nature, both its potential for greatness and its capacity for tragedy.